Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight we are diving back into Essential X-Men Volume 7, and we are going to be talking about the 4-issue miniseries Fantastic Four versus the X-Men. So that was a miniseries that came out in 1986, and it was written by Chris Claremont and illustrated by penciler John Bogdanove with inker Terry Austin. And the cover art, here's the cover art for Part 1. An evil-looking Reed Richards there. Then Part 2. Rather ominous-looking Dr. Doom. And that particular cover art's reproduced for the back art of this particular volume of Essential X-Men. And Part 3. And last but not least, Part 4. With a very spooky looking Franklin Richards about to, send Doom to his infernal reward, it looks like. So this particular miniseries was something that works in a lot of ways because on one hand you have two superhero teams. You got the Fantastic Four and you got the X-Men. And these two teams have had occasion to team up on more than one time or another. But this is the first time that they are pitted against each other. And so while there were elements of that within, say, something like the original Secret Wars series, this is the first time we've had two teams, like two whole teams, at each other's throats. And so the trick is, if you're going to have a story like this and you're going to have, two, teams of superheroes, genuinely, fighting each other, you have to have a story that, one, it makes sense, as to, why the two teams would be crossing paths with one another. And two, it has to make sense as to, why they're suddenly fighting each other. And three, when there's, say, a misunderstanding that's, been resolved, peace has to be made, and it has to be, something that feels earned. And thankfully, this particular story, or I should say miniseries, checks off all the boxes, and the fact that you have Chris Claremont, the guy who kind of set the gold standard, he didn't he did set the gold standard for writing the X-Men, at the helm of this particular miniseries, definitely helps because, he's got history with, both the X-Men and to some degree the Fantastic Four, in the sense that, he's written some of the stories wherein the Fantastic Four show up, but he's definitely on his A game when it comes to writing the X-Men. And so he's also working from events within the X-Men series that, put the X-Men in a sort of state of anxiety and fear, and reluctance to, trust, other people. Because this is not that long after the mutant massacre, wherein the majority of the underground, mutants, the Morlocks, were wiped out by the Marauders, and there were only a few survivors. And they, along with, three team members who were also casualties, Colossus, Nightcrawler, and Shadowcat, were all sent to Moira McTaggart's medical facility on Muir Island in Scotland. And so the X-Men at this point in time have kind of been going back and forth between Scotland and their mansion in Westchester. So there's been there's been some teasing of a meeting with the Fantastic Four, or at the very least Doctor Doom, within a couple of issues, because at one point in one of the issues, we saw this cargo boat rescuing someone who was drowning, and this is off the coast of Scotland, and this particular individual who was rescued, both occasions that he's shown with this particular crew, he's sort of blending in. He's pretending to be grateful to be rescued and everything, but apparently this is in some way a plan of Doctor Doom's, because when he's thinking to himself, he's referring to Doctor Doom as his master, and something about plan. And so we know something's going to happen with Doctor Doom at some point. And so we finally see that particular plan come to fruition in more than one way. And so it starts off with Franklin Richards, the son of Reed Richards and Sue Storm, Mr. Fantastic and Invisible Woman from the Fantastic Four, respectively. And Franklin Richards, he has the ability to project himself into the waking world when he's asleep. So like his real body will be asleep, but this sort of dream form will emerge and be able to go wherever, and it could be his real body could be, say, in New York, but he could send his dream form to some other part of the world. And in this case, his dream form ultimately ends up going to Scotland later on in the story. But one of the other things about him is that he has sometimes had what he calls special dreams, and these are dreams that have in one way or another come true, and oftentimes these are very ominous moments of foreshadowing. And so he's having this nightmare where he sees his father, Reed Richards, carrying the dead body of his mother, Sue Storm, and they're walking along this path, and there are members of the Fantastic Four, the Thing, Ben Grimm, the Thing, Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, and She-Hulk, are all lying dead. And then and Franklin, he's telling his dad to stop and to not go up the stairs, because he's heading to up the staircase, and where he's intent on casting his wife into the fire. And there's also this book that's waiting for him, and he's intent on getting to the book, and regardless of how much Franklin is begging him to stop, and literally grabbing his body to a point where it's warping and stretching, and Reed Richards just ignores his son, telling him that this is something that he has to do, and he's a scientist, and everything will turn out fine, even though the Fantastic Four are dead. But then Wolverine shows up, and he's carrying a dead body as well, and this is actually Kitty Pryde, aka Shadowcat. And Wolverine's saying something to Reed Richards about how we trusted you with her life, and you let us down, and you killed her. And right then and there, he tries to attack Reed Richards, but Reed Richards simply sidesteps him and hits him. And Wolverine, at this point in this nightmare, had already been wounded somehow and basically just falls down dead. And, Franklin, he was pursuing his father, after he casts Sue Storm into the fire. And then, he gets this book that he was, making his way to in the first place. And it's a journal from when Reed Richards was in his college days. And as he opens it up, he starts to change into Doctor Doom, and even starts to sound like Doctor Doom, and basically mocking Franklin and at how helpless he is at preventing Doom's ultimate victory. And so Franklin wakes up, and he's naturally quite terrified, and he tries to tell his dad and his mom about what happened, but Reed, he's too busy working on some scientific experiments. And when he gets involved in his work, he gets tunnel vision. So he asks Sue if she can see what's going on with Franklin and take care of him. And so Sue, she uses her powers of invisibility to bring Franklin over by way of like this force field bubble to where she is. And so she comforts him and cheers him up, and she's asking him what happened, and he's telling her that I had one of my special dreams. And he's saying that you all of you and the X-Men were all dead. And she's trying to comfort him, and saying that, hey, it was just a bad dream. But on the other hand, though, the fact that he's had these quote unquote special dreams before are something that sort of put her on edge. But she tries to play it off, and says, well, hey, since you can't go back to sleep, why don't you help me unload some of this stuff that we got from storage. And so they'd been moving some stuff around for from one building to another, apparently, and they have some stuff from, say, like their families, like from way back in the day. Like, for example, there's a set of silverware from one of her relatives that she's just now seeing for the first time. And so she and Franklin are going through some of the stuff, and then she finds this book. And to Franklin's horror, it's the exact same book from his nightmare, the one that his father started to read from and then turned into Doctor Doom. And Franklin's, begging his mom to, not open it, to just, throw it away. But she ends up, reading it, and she comes across some very shocking information. And so she ends up confronting Reed Richards about this, and of course, he's like, "Oh, what's wrong?" And she shows him this stuff that he wrote, and he's looking through it. And the thing is, a lot of the stuff that's written in this journal, it is from when he was in college, and it goes along with his mindset at the time. And he was talking about how, and this is before the Fantastic Four came into existence, but he was talking about how there's an increasing number of superhumans coming into existence in the world, and how, there are many that seem to, be using their newfound powers for selfish gains or for evil. And so it stands to reason that in order to counter this group of supervillains or evil superhumans, there would have to be a group of superhumans that would use their powers for good. And so this is something that he had debated with people oftentimes on multiple occasions in his college days. But she shows him this particular entry wherein he's talking, or he's writing about their experimental space flight, the one that would ultimately end up transforming them into the Fantastic Four due to their ship being exposed to, this, strange cosmic radiation or solar radiation or something like that. And basically, according to his journal, um, he knew about the risks. He knew that the ship was inadequately shielded, from such radiation. But he went ahead and, gave the green light for the launch anyway, and deliberately allowed he himself, his, wife, or his, now wife, Sue Storm, and his friends Ben Grimm and Johnny Storm, to go up into space and be exposed to this, solar, this strange, cosmic radiation that would ultimately end up transforming them into the Fantastic Four. Now, according to his journal, he knew this was going to happen. They didn't, though, but he couldn't. He felt like he, couldn't take the chance that, there'd be enough time, for, say, another group of superhumans to, say, come together to use their powers for good in order to, fight this, increasing, number of evil superhumans. And so, he's looking at this and he's mortified, because some of this stuff he clearly remembers writing, but some of it, though, it's like, he can't say that he didn't write it, but at the same time, looking at himself now and who he is now, as a father, and as a husband, there's no way he would, write something like that, today. There's no way he would go through with something like that today, because, even Ben Grimm earlier, I mean, prior to this little, revelation, had been talking with him, and Reed Richards had asked him about, do you think I'm, he's basically, trying to ask, Ben Grimm if, sometimes he's, too smart for his own good, or something along those lines. And Ben Grimm tells him that, I wouldn't say, you're too smart for your own good. I would say that you're the most certain person I know. And he points out how Reed would, check every single angle. And we're talking like every angle that one could think of, every angle one couldn't think of. And then, go through calculations and projections on more than once, backwards and forwards. And only then would he go through, with whatever experiment he's going to be working on. And so he said that the one time he saw him fail in that regard was the flight that ended up turning them into the Fantastic Four. And so fast forward to when, Sue Storm has shown this journal to Ben Grimm and Johnny Storm. All three of them are furious with him, because, I mean, they had no say in the matter. And they're like, what gave you the right? I mean, who do you think you are, playing God with our lives? And so, I mean, this just breaks Reed, because, I mean, here he is, I mean, with this group of people that's basically become his family, and, he genuinely loves and cares about them, and, he takes his responsibilities as, the head of the family, seriously, as well as the responsibilities of, the team as a team leader. But then, here he is being hit with this damning evidence that, he deliberately, sabotaged their lives. And so, he's trying to, figure out, like, why the hell would I have done something like this? And they're even pointing out that the right handwriting is exactly the same, as, say, like, the writing style is the exact same writing style they had back in college. And so, this wasn't something that, someone did recently. Like, this wasn't like, say, some, prank that someone just, randomly snatched a journal in, the 1980s and, wrote some bogus entries and then just, tossed it back in the junk. Because, I mean, this journal has been in storage for Lord knows how many years. And, it hasn't been opened since, his college days. And so anyway, so that's where the Fantastic Four are at. And so the X-Men, they get involved when, they're trying to, help Moira McTaggart find a cure for, Kitty Pryde, because, due to the events that happened in the Mutant Massacre, she was, stuck in a state of intangibility, and to where she's literally becoming a ghost, and she's, fading apart even more every single day. And the only thing that they have that can sort of slow it down is this sort of, energy, matrix storage device, where her intangible body is having to stay, just to keep from completely dispersing. But at the same time, though, her body is breaking down on a cellular level, more and more each day. And so the only way that they can, really communicate with her is with the assistance of Psylocke, who has her telepathic abilities. And so she sort of oftentimes acts as a go-between, for, say, anyone wanted to talk with her, and, to Kitty Pryde, and vice versa. So it's a very, stressful time, for them, because, they have, the surviving Morlocks that are still in Moira's medical facility, and some of them are pulling through, but a lot of them are gradually, dying out. And so, and Nightcrawler and Colossus are still in more or less comatose states. I mean, because Nightcrawler's literally in a coma, and Colossus is basically paralyzed. And so while he may be awake and alert, he literally cannot move. And so in the meantime, the X-Men, with, Magneto as, their leader, along with Storm, have come across some research entries that Reed Richards did, years ago, pertaining to a situation that's very similar to what's going on with Kitty Pryde. And so basically, he had actually, created this machine that could basically reverse the effects of something being made intangible. And so, they're thinking, hey, this is Reed Richards talking. I mean, if anyone can create a machine like this that can actually do something like that, it would be him. And so, they actually end up, crossing paths with the Fantastic Four in a moment wherein there's a sort of disaster where there's like a busted gas main or something like that, where there's like multiple explosions in the city streets. And so the Fantastic Four, namely, or I should say members of the Fantastic Four, Ben Grimm and She-Hulk, who is with the Avengers at this time, but happened to be in the same library as, Ben Grimm, and She-Hulk was actually in the process of doing research for a mock trial for Magneto, because he had actually, had a trial that was interrupted, back in X-Men 200, and so, she, as a lawyer, she and, she and the people that she worked with were wanting to say prepare, for a real trial for Magneto, or for Magneto to be retried, since his original trial was interrupted. And so she drew the short straw of being Magneto's defense attorney, or at least playing his defense attorney in this sort of legal role play that they've got going on, just in the event that Magneto actually is retried. And so she initially had thought that this was like a cut and dry case, because Magneto is the master of magnetism. He hates all humans and all that. But the more she researched his actions, the more she started to find that they weren't so cut and dry, or at least not all of them were. And as of late, I mean, he's been going out of his way to show that he's a changed man, like that he's trying to work for the good of both mutant kind and humankind as well. And so she and Ben Grimm, they happen to bump into each other in the same library, which is when the explosion happens. And so the two of them are able to try and keep these buildings from collapsing. But then Magneto himself comes onto the scene and uses his magnetism to, keep things in place. And then Human Torch comes onto the scene, and Magneto's actually, commanding him, telling him to, do what he can to, put the fire out. Since Human Torch, I mean, he's basically living flame, so, or he can turn into living flame, more or less. And so at first Human Torch is like on it, but then he's like, wait a minute, that was Magneto. Why the hell am I taking orders from Magneto? But while there is this moment where he contemplates attacking Magneto because he knows Magneto is a villain, Ben and She-Hulk are both saying, for one, just for this once, do what he says. And so Human Torch, Johnny Stormy helps put the fire out, and in Magneto and Ben and She-Hulk, they basically keep things from getting worse, and the building's going to have to be demolished just for safety reasons, but they prevented the fire from breaking out and killing people. So at this point, Magneto tells them that they actually need to talk to Reed Richards, because they have a dire situation that he may have the remedy for. And so basically they communicate the situation to Reed Richards, and Magneto he talks this over with the X-Men, and he tells them that he's the only way the Fantastic Four are going to trust him is if he approaches them of his own free will, and talks with them one-on-one, because he's trying to prove to the Fantastic Four as well as to the world at large that he's not the villain he once was. And so he sure enough goes to the Fantastic Four and tells them what's going on. And initially this sounds like a cut and dry situation, except this is the point where Reed Richards is having kind of a mental crisis because of the information from this journal that he wrote back in the day. And so of course, I mean the X-Men are allies, and so he's like, yes, we'll do whatever we can to help you guys. But then so the X-Men they head back to Muir Island, and the Fantastic Four they go ahead and see about getting that machine that Reed Richards had built back in the day, and to have it brought to Muir Island in Scotland. And so so there's definitely, a measure of hope being brought to, Moira McTaggart and her medical team, as well as to Kitty Pryde and the X-Men. And so when the Fantastic Four arrive, um, you know, they're able to bring the machine, and Reed, though, he can't bring himself to, you know just nonchalantly use the machine on Kitty, though. And I mean, he goes over the calculations and everything looks okay, but he just feels that there's something wrong, there's something that he's missing. And how much of that is because there's something wrong, something missing, versus how much of it is him, you know, being rattled by this newfound information, or at least information that he doesn't remember, putting down in his journal, but he can't deny, putting down. Um, it's, a little bit of both, but then he, sadly tells the X-Men that, um, he's not going to be able to use the machine to save her, Kitty's life. And so at that point, the X-Men, they, feel betrayed, because, I mean, this is someone who's been an ally to them, but then, to out and out say that he's not going to use the machine on Kitty without, telling them why, I mean, this just enrages them. And so, Wolverine's the one who ends up starting the fight, and, takes a shot at Mr. Fantastic, because, I mean, Kitty Pryde is, someone who's like family to him, as are the rest of the X-Men, but, Kitty especially. And so, with the assembled team, it's kind of like an all-out brawl. Um, and, both sides are actually able to get some good hits in, but things sort of come to a head when, Human Torch lashes out with his flame powers and accidentally, burns Storm, who at this point in time, I should mention, is, still powerless. But he burns her arm really badly, to a point where, she is going to need medical attention, serious medical attention. And so, you know, so once, that happens, the X-Men and the Fantastic Four, they both sort of like, pump the brakes on this, and, try and, try and calm things down, which is when, the aforementioned stranger that had been rescued, but who was apparently working for Doctor Doom, reappears. And it turns out that, while he was in the medical infirmary, his body basically started, shifting and changing. And it turns out that he's actually an android that was created by Doctor Doom, that was, sent, to spy on Moira McTaggart and her medical efforts for, the surviving Morlocks, as well as for the wounded X-Men, including Kitty Pryde. And the reason that Doctor Doom had created this guy to spy on them was because, even in Latveria, he had heard about, the mutant massacre, and the brutal extent of it, was something that alarmed even him. And so someone was clearly declaring war on mutant kind. And since the X-Men were, people that had occasion to cross his paths on more than one occasion, he decided that, he needed to, learn as much as he could about, what happened to the X-Men, as well as if, the ones who did this to them and the Morlocks would be an ongoing threat, not just against mutant kind, but say potentially against him as well. And so, as it happens, this android, I mean, is watching the X-Men and the Fantastic Four fight each other. And once, the android, has seen enough, it basically, communicates to Doctor Doom, and that, to a point where, Doctor Doom is able to use the android, to interact with the Fantastic Four and the X-Men, and the android projects this giant, holographic image of Doom that talks to them, talks to both Fantastic Four and the X-Men, and explains what his rationale was for spying on Moira McTaggart and the mutants in her medical facility, but also on keeping tabs on the X-Men. But when he realized why the Fantastic Four and the X-Men were fighting each other, he basically says that he can actually save Kitty Pryde, by building upon Reed Richards' designs for the machine and refining them. And so, since Reed Richards has made it clear that he's unwilling to try and use this machine to save Kitty, the X-Men are forced to reluctantly accept Doctor Doom's aid, even though the Fantastic Four are begging them not to, because they know Doom. They know that any good deed from him, at least as far as they've been concerned, has come with a catch, a price, something that they have to pay for down the road. And so in this point, the X-Men, they've had some interaction with Doom to a point where they know that what the Fantastic Four are saying isn't wrong, but this is Kitty Pryde's life on the line. And so since Mr. Fantastic, their supposed friend and ally, has flat out refused to use this machine to save Kitty, basically they're left with no choice but to go and accept Doctor Doom's aid. And so they end up heading to Latveria, and bringing Kitty Pryde in her storage chamber with them. And so from there, you see how like the X-Men are sort of passing time in Latveria, and Doctor Doom's actually commanded his security forces to stand down. He has a lot of automated robots and other security measures, and he has it set up to where the X-Men are free to wander the grounds, so long as they don't interfere with his work or cause any further mischief. And so the X-Men are going through their training exercises, or as much as they can, in something outside their danger room. And the Fantastic Four, ultimately decide that one, regardless of what Reed Richards may or may not have written back in the day, he's not the person that he once was, and they know him as the person he is now. And so the person he is now would have a very good reason for not going through with such an experimental effort to save Kitty Pryde's life. And also the person that he is now is someone that would not knowingly harm friends or family, let alone anyone else. And so they decide to basically forgive him, but also to work with him and find out what's really going on here, and or what may have happened all those years ago. But also they are determined to get to Latveria before the X-Men do, because they do not trust Doctor Doom with Kitty Pryde's life, and they know Doctor Doom better than the X-Men do. And so once the two teams converge once more, there's yet another all-out fight, but this time it's actually broken up by Franklin Richards, of all people, who at this point had stowed away on the Fantastic Four's plane, and so he's actually present on Mir Island, or not a Mir Island, sorry. He's actually present in Latveria, with, where they are on Doctor Doom's territory. And, Kitty Pryde's, pet and slash friend, the dragon Lockheed, was with them as well. And he and Franklin have actually kind of become friends, in a strange sort of fashion. But you see, Lockheed, with Franklin on his back, coming, down to try and, stop everyone. And it takes Franklin, a little kid, to, shock some, sense into them by, basically, calling them out for their stupid behavior, because, I mean, they're full-grown adults acting like little kids when, Kitty's dying. And as simplistic as, his summation is, it really gets to them, and they're like, yeah, we really are being idiots here. And so, they, decide to, work together and, basically, stop interfering with, Dr. Doom's, research, because unfortunately, it's been interfered with, more than once already, by way of, Magneto's use of, his powers, and, the use of his magnetism has actually inadvertently interfered with, Dr. Doom's instrumentations, that, he's, involved with in, trying to reformat, Reed Richards' research, and also, is potentially further destabilizing Kitty Pryde's, essence in her energy storage chamber. But once once the fighting has stopped, and once both the X-Men and the Fantastic Four agree to basically just work together here and see what they can do to help out. Both Reed and Doctor Doom actually end up working together on the machine. And also this is partially due to Franklin's involvement, because Reed and Doctor Doom both start arguing with each other, and Franklin actually begs them to stop, and asks them, does it really matter who's loudest or who's smarter, so long as Kitty's saved? I mean, does it matter? Does it really matter? As long as she's saved? And so that actually shuts them both up, even Doctor Doom. And so there you go. But but as Reed is going over the instrumentation and everything, even with Doctor Doom's refinements, he can't help but he can't help but feel that something's wrong. And so as it gets closer to the time for the machine to go into effect, and and do what it's supposed to do to help Kitty, Reed is telling them that there's something wrong with the machine. There's something wrong with the process. I don't know, but there's something wrong. We need to stop. And so once more they're like, are you serious right now? I mean, she's like literally minutes away from dying here. And at that point, Reed is put into a position where he's being taunted by Doom, and Doom's basically saying is there anything I can do to help you, old friend? Like, knowing that there's something going on with Reed in his head. And then on the other hand, you've got the X-Men. Basically some of them are wanting to say Rogue is wanting to absorb Reed's memories to try and see if she can do the process herself, or try and maybe get Psylocke to mentally possess Reed and do it herself, while manipulating Reed's body. But the problem with that would be if she did that to Reed, she wouldn't, be able to, help Kitty Pryde, to keep from, completely dispersing. And so, on the other hand, Rogue's idea, while it's understandable in its desperation, it would do more harm than good because, either way, Reed is going to have to. Reed either has to, let Rogue, do that for him, or he has to do it himself. Because if he lets Rogue do it for him or lets Psylocke take him over, he's not going to be able to, ever trust his own judgment again, even if Kitty's life is saved. But on the other hand, if he does it himself, there's the risk that, something will go wrong. And so this is basically, a battle only he can win. And Wolverine and Storm, they understand the logic, and they decide to let him use his best judgment. And so this time he goes through with the experiment, and working with the knowledge of both himself and Doom, he's able to use the machine to save Kitty's life. And she's still stuck in an intangible state, but within time, she will be able to turn back into her regular solid form once more. And so the X-Men and the Fantastic Four end up having a sort of celebratory feast hosted by Doom. And it seems like everything's calmed down, and Storm's arm was even treated by Doom himself earlier on. And so basically the bad blood that briefly arose between the X-Men and Fantastic Four because of Johnny burning her, it's water under the bridge. But it looks like a couple of altercations may be about to happen, because Magneto approaches Mr. Fantastic, approaches Reed Richards. And so both the Fantastic Four and the rest of the X-Men are watching this. They're like, get ready to step in, guys. But Magneto actually apologizes to Reed Richards for, having, initiated the fight, earlier on, back when they had initially approached, Reed, and then he had refused, to, help them. And basically Magneto just, takes responsibility for what happened, in a sense that, it was a rash action on his part in terms of lashing out. And, had he known what was going on at the time, he would have, probably counseled the rest of the X-Men to hold back as well. And he certainly would have held back too, but all he can do is apologize for, his part in things. And, Reed actually, accepts his apology, and, tells him that, it's true that, so much of the world still sees you as the villain you once were, but that villain, you would not have had the wherewithal to, say the words you said just now. So, basically, he feels like, the rest of the world, can trust Magneto, or at least, it's a starting point for, the world, to be able to trust him, that he is actually trying to be a better person. But Sue, though, is actually, confronting Doctor Doom. And so she does it through like a fake smile, but she tells him, though, that she knows that he was behind, all this, in the sense that, there was, who else, besides Reed Richards, was as smart as he was, and vice versa. And basically, Doom was the only one who could match Reed Richards in terms of, say, intellect and scientific, achievement and what have you. And, Reed Richards was the only one that, Doom, couldn't, say, beat in a debate, or, couldn't, say, force, his weight on, as far as, like, his, thoughts and his, willpower, and so to speak. But then, and she says, who else, knew Reed well enough to know that, he had the thoughts they did back then? Who else, talked, so in depth, with Reed, about, his thoughts on superhumans back then, because it certainly wasn't the rest of the Fantastic Four. And so, then she, flat out, you know, calls him on it. She calls him on, forging, Reed's writing style, and, basically, writing the entries in the journal that basically, led to the rest of the Fantastic Four, years later, thinking that Reed Richards himself had deliberately chosen to, expose them to, the cosmic radiation that turned them into the Fantastic Four. Because, I mean, these plans were in place, but, Doom was the only one who would have had insight into Reed Richards' mind at the time, as far as his thoughts on, the rise of the superhumans and the, potential problems, down the road if, say, the vast majority of them were evil, and that the world needed a group of good superhumans. And so, Doom would have been able to, say, out of spite, manipulate Reed Richards without him even knowing it. He, would have been able to go in, write in Reed's journal, and then just, walk along as if, nothing had happened. And Reed probably wouldn't have even have noticed it, had he gone back to retrace those entries, which he never did, apparently. And so it was only when, that particular journal, was found in storage all those years later, that's when, Doom's, gambit, finally came to pass. And so, Doom himself, and had almost forgotten about that, but once, he, realized, what all the fuss was about, he knew, once he saw, Reed holding that journal, when they came to Latveria, he remembered. And so when Sue's calling him out on all this, he's, politely, denying any knowledge of the event, and he keeps insisting that she, try the caviar, which Latveria is very well known for in terms of cuisine. But Sue, basically says, look, if I wanted to, I could kill you right now, using my powers to, cut off your air supply, even through that armor of yours. But, since Kitty Pryde's, life was saved, we'll call it even. And so she walks away, and, Doom just sort of, smiles mischievously behind his mask. But at that point, the Fantastic Four and the X-Men, they're all like, okay, crisis averted. And, they go on with the evening. And, the last we see is, Franklin, using his dream form to, check in on, Kitty Pryde. And, since, she's still kind of a ghost and he's in his intangible dream form, the two of them are actually able to, sort of, go on a little waltz together. And so the story ends on kind of a happy upbeat note though. But I'd say though that this was actually a good story. It was something that it made sense as far as a team up story goes, but it also had what made sense as far as, say, you know a super team battling another super team type of story goes. And I appreciated that about the story because, I mean, like I said earlier, in order to have, say, a team up story, it has to make sense for it to happen. But in order to have a fight story happen, or for us to get involved in the fight story, it has to make sense as to why the two teams would fight each other. And here, we actually do understand why, because, I mean, this is one of their own who, is on the verge of dying. And, here is someone who's supposed to be a friend of theirs flat out refusing, to use his, expertise and knowledge, to do so. And granted, there's a lot of miscommunication going on in the story, but the way that miscommunication happens, it's something that is believable. Now, granted, a lot of that is, due to, Doom's, actions all those years ago with Reed Richards' journal, but the thing is, we don't know that yet. And even Doom hadn't exactly counted on it, coming into play all these years later. But if Reed had simply, explained, why he felt that, they couldn't use the machine at that point, I think that, I mean, yeah, a lot of conflict would have been, if not resolved, then at least, you know, restrained. But at the same time, the X-Men was still, I think, tried to find a way to save Kitty, using that machine. They just might not have gone all out on, attacking the Fantastic Four, because a lot of that was, them lashing out emotionally, or they were going, off of their emotions as opposed to, say, logic and strategy and what have you. Because, what they might have done was, I mean, had Reed told them, why he felt like they wouldn't be able to use the machine to save Kitty, and why, he wouldn't be able to, make the machine work, I mean, or why the machine might not work, or, what was going on with him at the time, as far as like his mental crisis, I mean, the X-Men probably wouldn't have lashed out like they did, but they probably still would have tried to find a way, say, like later through, say, stealth, to maybe steal the machine or something like that. But because the situation is as emotionally fraught as it was, it makes sense that, Reed, ref- while his refusal makes sense, the fact that he is so wrapped up in himself, and questioning himself, that he can't, bring himself to consider that, hey, maybe I should tell these people, why it's not a good idea to use this machine yet, or right now. I mean, the fact that Reed Richards is that rattled, I mean, that's something that you don't see, with this character a lot. And so that's when you know that, something's wrong. And it actually works out in the story's favor, big time, because we see, Reed Richards, one of the smartest men in the world, having, a mental, breakdown almost. And so when you have that going on, he's not going to be, thinking, full on logically like he normally would, but in the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, on the other hand, they're already, stressed out and on edge with all the stuff that happened with the mutant massacre, but when you have someone who's supposed to be a friend of theirs straight up refusing to help them without any explanation, yeah, it makes sense that they snap and lash out like they do. And it's ironic that Magneto's the one of the first ones to attack, him being a supervillain and all, but the fact that he was supposed to be the team leader, I mean, in sort of shepherding, Charles Xavier's, dream of, peace and, between, humans and mutants. I mean, not exactly his finest hour, but at the same time, not something that we can, necessarily fault him for, considering that, you know, once more, Reed is not telling them why, why he's refusing to use the machine on Kitty. He's refusing to tell them, what just happened. And as far as like on his side of things. And so Magneto, not knowing any of this, I mean, he's just seeing, someone who is, who who's basically considers himself above mutant kind, or at least above those that aren't, say, immediate kin, and basically considers Kitty Pryde's life worthless. And so at that point, it's definitely understandable why both Magneto and Wolverine lash out like they do, as well as the rest of the X-Men. Although in the rest of their cases, it's more like, they're sort of following the leader, but they're also acting on, the anger of this seeming betrayal. But something that I thought was interesting, though, is that, I mean, it's not touched on a whole lot, but to me, I feel like, Longshot's, because this is a point where, Longshot's a member of the team, but, he's, got this, luck power, and because he was genetically engineered, in another dimension, and his creator literally gave him, this luck power that, basically things fall into favor for him, if he's acting altruistically. And so earlier on in the story, he and Dazzler are the ones who find that lone survivor of the cargo ship, who turns out to be the android that was sent by Doom to spy on Mirror Island. But if Longshot hadn't found the guy, with like if his luck power hadn't kicked in when it did, and he hadn't found the guy, even though this guy turned out to be a robot who was created by Doctor Doom, if that hadn't happened, then the android may very well have been stuck in the water for Lord knows how long, and not have been able to record anything that was going on Mirror Island. But because Dazzler and Longshot were in the right place at the right time, and Longshot's luck power kicked in when it did, he was able to find that android, or the guy who turned out to be an android. And when the android saw that was on the island when it was, and saw the X-Men and the Fantastic Four fighting each other, and relayed all that to Doom, I mean, and then Doom stepped in, well, none of that would have happened, if Longshot and his luck power hadn't been there. So I just think that it's interesting how you have, I mean, even though Longshot doesn't have like a huge part to play in the story, his luck power does seem to affect things in such a way to where it's like on the surface it's trivial, but then you look at how the rest of the story comes out, and on some level I feel like that luck may have had more to do with it than we think that it did. So it is cool, to see how, I mean, like with the rest of the X-Men, for example, I mean, you see like, Havoc, still butting heads with people like Rogue, because, I mean, here he is, one of the former members of the X-Men, now, trying to, earn his place, with the new X-Men. And of course, Rogue is not too friendly with him because, he was kind of harsh with her, a while back. But basically, though, I mean, you have this element of distrust, between, say, like Havoc and, the rest of the X-Men, because, Rogue and Magneto, were once criminals, and people like Wolverine are very violent, and so basically these aren't the X-Men that he knew and loved, and but he's in a situation where he's having to you know try and you know coexist with them. And so he's not quite at the point where he's full on friends yet, but there's still a lot of progress, to be made. But I did like seeing Psylocke and her powers in use, as well as her continuing characterization, because I mean, she's a young woman who's very bright, very intelligent, and she has a lot of responsibility, though, in terms of, say, you know helping Moira McTaggart and her medical team, as well as, say, acting as a go-between, between Kitty Pryde and anyone who wants to talk to her. Because as a telepath, you feel all the stuff that, or you're able to, read the minds of, and the thoughts of all these people around you. And so, and just imagine all the stuff that's going on, all the stress of, say, the medical staff, or, her fellow X-Men, or Kitty Pryde. And so I liked seeing that, but nonetheless, though, I mean, as stressed out as she was, she, still held together well under fire, especially towards the end when, she's literally the only thing that's keeping Kitty from completely, dispersing, because, the energy chamber, was reaching its limits, and, she was, using her uh, telepathic powers to, try and, keep, Kitty together. And it was taking a toll on her. But, you saw just, you kind of get an idea of just how, powerful of a telepath she is. I mean, you kind of have seen that in other stories where she's literally able to take control of someone. But you also saw there were limits, though, because the idea is broached of her, you know, taking over Reed Richards and either reading his mind and using that information, or just reading his mind and possessing his body to, operate the machine himself. But, of course, she points out that, I mean, yes, she could do that, but that would also mean, her not being able to, keep Kitty together. And so I like seeing this was still at a point in time where, the X-Men, I mean, they were depicted as being powerful with their abilities and everything, but there were limits, though. And so, um, I do appreciate seeing that. Um, but I mean, just in general, I thought that both the Fantastic Four and the X-Men were written well. And some people might say that, oh no, the whole thing's stupid. I mean, the fact that they that Reed was for just a moment convinced that he actually wrote those things in the journal, and everything. But the thing is, I mean, like Sue Storm points out later in the story, who else but Doctor Doom, or Victor Von Doom, would have had the knowledge, about superhumans, that Reed had. I mean, who else, but Doctor Doom would have had motivation to go in and, say, try and manipulate, Reed, in a way that he wouldn't even know he was being manipulated until it was too late, and which basically came to pass. I mean, this is Doctor Doom we're talking about. So even before he became Doctor Doom, he was a very manipulative individual. So, and we also kind of get an idea of how far, Reed Richards, as well as the rest of the Fantastic Four, has progressed as characters, since their first appearances. But, especially in the case of Reed Richards, because, as Ben Grimm pointed out, earlier in the story, Reed was someone that, was certain he was right. And so, the fact that he had these ideas about, there being a necessity for a group of, superhumans using their powers for good to counter the, overwhelmingly evil superhumans. I mean, that's something that he felt sure about. But, you know, the fact that he couldn't remember whether or not he, you know, was so convinced of, his ideas that he was willing to, risk his friends' lives. I mean, the fact that he couldn't remember if he was actually that cold and calculating at one point was something that speaks volumes, because, I mean, this is someone who is so sure of themselves, and that, there are so many things that, like, yes, they remember and everything, but they might not be able to remember, every single thing from the past. And so, and this is a journal that, he literally hadn't looked at since college, and it's been in storage all this time. And so there's no way, I mean, anyone could have, suspected, Doom of being the one who ultimately, pulled this off, albeit without really trying to. Just, it was something that, he thought was going to, shake Richards up back in the day, but he certainly didn't think that it was going to, come to pass, decades later. So, but at the same time, I mean, I really liked seeing how, Reed Richards was grappling with all this, like how he was wrestling with this inner turmoil, and more than once, gave into it. But at the end of the day, though, I mean, the person that, he is versus the person that he was ultimately was the one who won, because the person that he is, at least at this point in the story, is a far wiser man than the person that he once was. Like, he was brilliant back then, but he's had years of experience as part of the Fantastic Four, and as a father, and as a husband, to basically learn some things about life, and just about improving himself, as a man and as a person too, and as a leader. And so we genuinely come to appreciate just how far, Reed Richards has come, from, say, his, beginnings back in the day to where he is now, at least at this point in the story. So I really thought that, Chris Claremont, did a good job, I mean, with characterizing both the X-Men and the Fantastic Four. And I liked how, I mean, the way he wrote Franklin Richards, it kind of made me think of how Louise Simonson wrote him whenever he was, say, with the Super Team Power Pack, which was a cute book, and it's been years since I read that book, but I remember I read a few issues back in the day, and they were fun, they were cute. But I feel like Chris Claremont kind of took some cues from Louise Simonson in terms of, say, how Franklin Richards was written, because, I mean, he's such a good-hearted kid, and his, writing is a little naive, but the thing is, he's a little kid. Of course he's going to be naive. And I really liked how, I mean, there were so many moments where, he was the voice of reason, and yet, the adults in the room, refused to see reason until he was literally screaming in their faces. And, say, in the case of, the climax of the book, it's not until, he comes riding in on a dragon that they shut up and pay attention, so that him riding on a dragon probably had a lot to do with it as well. But I mean, but yeah, it's like, I really liked, how Franklin Richards was written, because, I mean, he's a good-hearted kid who's kind of in over his head, but, it's his very innocence, though, and his, sincerity that's able to, break through, the anger and the confusion of the whole situation, and even gives Dr. Doom pause. So that's saying something right there. And of course, I mean, I'd be remiss, if I, didn't mention how, once more, Chris Claremont does a good job of handling Doctor Doom because, you know, at this point, I mean, Doctor Doom was shown to be a very complex villain, um, and someone who is very charismatic, but also very manipulative. And that's in full swing in this particular story because we don't doubt that he could save Kitty Pryde, but of course we're also trying to figure out, okay, if the X-Men take his offer, what's going to be the price down the road, because Doctor Doom doesn't, at least at this point in time, doesn't do anything for free, and for all intents and purposes, this could have been just a moment where Doctor Doom saw his hated you know rival Reed Richards in a moment of utter weakness and decided to one up him or something like that. But considering when this was going on and considering what had happened and Doctor Doom's reasons for wanting to spy on, Muir Island as well as, say, the rest of the X-Men, I mean, there's a chance that Doctor Doom was more than likely going to use the situation to his advantage as far as trying to get the X-Men into his debt, and so we understand the X-Men's logic, and we also understand the Fantastic Four's logic of trying to stop the X-Men from accepting Doom's help. But we really come to appreciate Doom as a sort of puppet master type villain, and basically he's running the show and pulling the strings even when he doesn't know he's running the show or pulling the strings, at least in this case. And so yeah, I mean, that was a very good depiction of Doom in this story, courtesy of Chris Claremont. But yeah, I mean, all in all, though, I thought this was a good story. I thought that it was a credible one as far as why the X-Men and Fantastic Four crossed paths in the first place, and also why they ended up fighting as well. But the resolution made sense too, because I mean, it's like both sides ended up making peace at the end of the day, and it was done in a believable manner. So and the artwork by John Bogdanove and Terry Austin was well done as well. It's for the most part it's consistent with the artwork that's come before in other X-Men stories as well as Fantastic Four stories. So I'm gonna go ahead and give Fantastic Four versus the X-Men 5 out of 5 stars. It was a great story. So I'll show you all some of the artwork real quick. So here's kind of like the first page of the opening nightmare sequence. There's Wolverine carrying Kitty Pryde and Reed Richards carrying Sue. And there's the dead X-Men right there. This is after the nightmare, but this is, Reed in his laboratory here. And there's Sue Storm using her invisible powers to bring Franklin over to her. And there she is finding the journal, the very same one from Franklin's nightmare. And so here we are on Muir Island. And Rogue and Havoc kind of getting into it. And so here's the here, some parts of the medical facility right here. That's where Magneto's communicating to Storm and the rest of the X-Men about the information they found about Reed Richards' machine. And then right here, we've got Longshot and Dazzler out in the ocean in a motorboat. And at first, they're just, having fun and everything. And then, Longshot looks into the water and at first kind of just entranced at the water's beauty, because apparently, from what he remembers about where he came from, he's never seen an ocean before. And so he's just entranced by the ocean's beauty. But then, of course, his luck power just kind of kicks in and dives in, and Dazzler uses her light powers to try and brighten things up, so to be able to find him. And lo and behold, they find the stranger, the one who was the only survivor of that cargo ship, who ultimately turns out to be an android for Dr. Doom. And so this is where, Sue is taking Reed Richards to task about the journal. And Franklin helplessly looking on in his dream form. There's She-Hulk, bumping into Ben Grimm in the library. And then the explosion happens. And so at first it's just the two of them, trying to, keep things from falling apart or at least buy time. And then Magneto comes in and saves the day, or plays a big part in saving the day. So this is the part where, Ben's, talking with Reed about how, he's sure he's no certain guy that he knows, except for that one time that, you kind of miscalculate and we all turned into Fantastic Four, And here they are, meeting up with the X-Men. And here's Reed, kind of, having that mental break. And here he is refusing to help them. Which in turn kind of kicks off the fight. And so this is where, Storm reaches out to try and, stop Wolverine from hurting Reed Richards. But Johnny Storm, he lashes out with his flame powers and he means to hit Wolverine, but instead he, burns, Storm rather badly on her arm, which causes him to, kind of freak out. But then, like right here, here's the stranger who turns out to be the android. And here he is. Pretty good sci-fi horror art right there. Having his face change. But yeah, so this is after the fight's calmed down, but the android reveals himself and brings up this projection of Dr. Doom. And here he is offering to save Kitty Pryde, and Reed, of course, is telling the X-Men not to believe him, but and here they are telling the Fantastic Four to F off since they caused enough trouble. And then they are trying to help Storm. And this is when the rest of the Fantastic Four, calls Reed out on, what happened, because at this point, with the whole journal thing being in his handwriting, it looks like he very well may have set them up. But this is a little bit later on, but I always like this part in the book where the X-Men are just minding their own business, but unfortunately, they sort of cross paths with some of Doom's, security robots and come across as threats. And so they end up getting into a ruckus without meaning to. And they're only stopped by Doom and Storm, who has a newly healed arm, courtesy of Doom and his medical services. And I always like this couple of panels here. You got Kitty Pryde. She really does look like a ghost at this point. And there's Franklin in his dream form, watching it all, or watching her. But yes, so you have Spyro, her dragon, or I'm sorry, not Spyro, Lockheed, her dragon. And then you have, Kitty, who's basically a ghost at this point. And then you have Franklin, who is kind of a ghost, at least in terms of him being in his dream form. So you have two ghosts and a dragon in that picture. And I thought this series of panels was really beautiful too. I mean, Kitty, at this point, she's kind of suicidal, and, she's, made her way out of the energy chamber, and is making her way, outside to where she just wants to, see one last sunset before she dies, or sunrise. And Franklin, poor kid, he's begging her not to do it. And so is Lockheed in his own way. And then Lockheed basically roars for help, getting the attention of the X-Men. As well as Storm and Doom. But you got some psychedelic looking art right here with Psylocke's energy signature reaching out to, Kitty. And of course, Franklin, begging her, not to kill herself. But finally, though, it gets through to Kitty. And so when the X-Men, find her, or find them, she's back in her chamber, and Franklin's just sort of, holding her, or at least holding the energy chamber with her. But I thought this series of panels right here with Reed Richards, looking in on his son and just, holding him after everything that's happened, really humanized him. Because a lot of times he's written as kind of like this, soulless, brainiac. But the thing is, I mean, he is one of the smartest people on the planet. But at the end of the day, though, I mean, he's a human being, and he's got wife and kid, and the kid's most important thing to him. So, yeah, really good set of panels by John Bogdanove and Terry Austin. But and of course, Ben Grimm, when he goes to decompress, he goes to the old neighborhood, Yancey Street. He tosses him back a couple of beers, chowing down on some burgers. Guy's having a good time. Or he's trying to have a good time in a downbeat moment, But I always like this picture right here, Dr. Doom. Very much a Jack Kirby-esque moment. But this isn't the last part of the book, but this is where Franklin comes in. Actually, no, it's this right here. This is where Franklin comes in on flying on Lockheed to tell the adults to stop acting stupid. But I always thought that was a badass moment, from a little kid. But yeah, that was it. That was Fantastic Four versus the X-Men. If you made it this far, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoyed seeing some of the artwork at the end there, and I hope my summary did the story justice. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. If you got any questions, comments, please drop a line, let me know. Y'all take care. Have a good evening. Bye.